Morning, Maish. All right, Rabosai, good morning. Let us begin. Today's daf is Chavtes. I want to begin by thanking our sponsor, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Ed and Faith Wolf, in memory of beloved father, grandfather, great-grandfather, Cyrus Wolf, Shalom ben Tzvi Hirsch, and Binyamin Fleischman for dedicating the Shiurim this week in memory of Rabbi Shmuel Yudel ben Binyamin Yaakov. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshamas will have an aliyah and the families in Chacham. And also with that, let us begin. So we are picking up today's daf is Chavtes 29, and we are picking up on Chav Ches Amud Beis 28b at the two dots, which are 6 lines up from the bottom. Gufa, Amra Rav, Kashos v'Chaziz ma'arvin b'Hadim u'varchan le'ber piyadama. So Rabbi Yehuda says the name of Rav. Kishos, so we'll say which are hops. Chaziz, which is green grain, immature grain. So the halach is you could use it for an eruv, and furthermore you can make a bracha brei priyadama on it. So kishos bekama. So we'll say now the Gemara is transitioning a little bit. So yesterday we focused a little bit on. I forgot this. Chevron on Zoom, you hear me? Okay. Okay, excellent. So yesterday we were speaking about the brachas regarding these items. Now, this morning, the Gemara wants to focus a bit more on how much do you need of these items in order to create your eruv. As I say, we've mentioned it, although we don't exactly know where the source for this is. We'll see it, that for eruv you need enough food for 2 meals. So how much hops bekama? A handful of hops. Because it says we're going to see, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have enough hops for 2 meals, but rather we'll see it's the amount of hops that one would normally consume over the course of 2 meals. We'll see that. So therefore a handful of hops is enough. How much green grain? Ozilsa. Kemale ozilsa di ikare. So we'll say literally, if you look at Rashi, ozilsa, Rashi says, Vail belaz agudos yerek shekarchen haikar. So we'll say, so apparently green grain, enough that the farmers would bundle it in. So the farmers used to make bundles. So the amount of green grain, which would normally be part of a bundle, so that's the amount of green grain that you would use for your eruv. Amrav Chilke bar Tovia, ma'arvin bekalya. You can make an eruv with kalya. Now Rashi says, what's kalya? Kalach shal esav v'kasha keitz. It's a stalk of a plant, and it's very hard. So the Gemara says, how can you make an eruv with kalya? Rabbi say again, in general, the eruv, not in general, the eruv must be edible. So the kalya is not edible. How can you make an eruv from it? So the Gemara says, Ella biyarko de kalya. Rather, Rabbi say what it means is the greens of the kalya stalk. So the kalya stalk itself was hard and unedible, but it had greens which grew around it. Ultimately, again, those are edible and usable for eruv. V'kama, and how much of the greens of the kalya do you have to use? Rabbi Chil kimali hayad, a handful. Rabbi Yirmiyah nafek l'kiryasa. So one time Rabbi Yirmiyah went out to the city. They asked him, can you use moist lentils as your eruv? So Rabbi Yirmiyah didn't know. When he came to the base medrash, so apparently when he came to the base medrash, he posed the question, can you use moist lentils? And they said to him, Rabbi Yanai said, yes, you can make an eruv with moist lentils. V'kama, how much? What's the quantity of moist lentils necessary for an eruv? Amar bichil kimali hayad. A handful. So the Amar of Hamluna, ma'arvin b'tradin chayin. You can go to make an eruv with raw beets. Ini is that's of Amar of Chista. Silka chaya, katul gavra chaya. Raw beets kill a living person. I was supposed to say it's a little bit of a play on words. Silka chaya means a raw beet. So apparently raw beets are very detrimental to one's health. So how can you go ahead and make an eruv with something that is detrimental to your health? Top of Chavtes, hahu bibashil v'lo bashil. But say when is it that we say beets kill people? That's when it's not fully cooked. So apparently if you eat a beet when it's raw, it's okay. Fully cooked, it's okay, but ultimately, again, half cooked, partially cooked, that's when it's detrimental. Others explain, Amrav Hamnuna, different version. Hamnuna says you can't go ahead and make an eruv with raw beets. Because Rav Chista said that a raw beet kills a living person. But one second, we see people eat beets and they don't die, so it can't be true. The words hasam b'bashil v'lo bashil. That's again talking about when did Rav Hamnuna say that Allah Lamaisa beets kill? So that's again with a partially cooked beet. So we'll say again. So apparently raw beets, okay. Fully cooked beets, okay. Partially cooked beets, ultimately problematic. We'll say an incredible mussar in that, no? So, in life, if you want to be successful, you have to choose a side. You have to be bashil or low bashil. Either be cooked or don't be cooked. What's the problem? When you're bashil, low bashil, right? When you're partially cooked, nishtahin, nishtaher, you don't have an identity, you don't choose a side, you don't go ahead and take up a position. That's misa. That's death. Life is a lot. You can learn a lot from the beats, right? Again, raw, good. Cooked, good. Somewhere in the middle, wishy-washy, not cooked, not it. That's death. Amr of Chisda, incredible. Amr of Chisda, tafshil shel tradin. So also listen to this. A dish made out of beets, yafel lelev v'tov la'inayim, is good for the heart and good for the eyes. V'chosh kilim ne'me'ayin. I will say all the more so it's good for the intestines. Apparently, like, it flushes out the system. Amr Abaye says, v'hudi Yosef abeitovi v'avi tuch. But I will say it's only assuming that what? That the beets are cooking on the stovetop, and you hear them make tuch is the sound, I guess, that the beets make. No, I guess tuch is the sound that the beets make when they're boiling. So the Gemara says, Amar Rava says, Harini ke ben Azai b'shukei Tiberia. So let's listen to this. So Rava one time came along and he said, I am like Ben Azai when he stood in the marketplace of Tiberia. I will say, now what does that mean? Look at Rashi. Harini ke ben Azai b'shukei Tiberia. Rashi says, Yoma b'disa. So we'll say what Rava was saying was he was in a particularly good mood. He had an incredible clarity of mind, and what he essentially was saying was, ask me any question and I will answer. Why does he say Keben Azai? Keben Azai dorish b'shukei Tiberia v'lo haya b'yamav oker harim kimoso. So we'll say, the idea is Ben Azai was the greatest sage of his generation. Oker harim. Remember again, the Gemara has an interesting machlokas as to, is it better to be an Oker harim or better to be a Sinai? Oker harim means someone with profound analytical thought, right? He's able to dissect information in a precise analytical way. Uprooter of mountains. Is it better to be an uprooter of mountains or a Sinai? Sinai also means someone who possesses an incredible repository of knowledge. Might not have the same level of analytical skills, but possesses an incredible amount of knowledge. So which one is better? The Gemara argues back and forth. The maskana is, you need both. You need both. You need some people who are Oker harim, or you need people and some people who are Sinais. So Rava said, today I have clarity. So Ben Azai used to darshan in the shuk of Tiberia, and he had such clarity of mind whenever he presented issues. So Rava was in a good mood. He said, today I feel like Ben Azai in the shuk of Tiberia. Right? Give me your best questions. Give me anything and I'll answer. So one of the rabbis stepped forward. He said, Tapuchim bekama. If you want to use apples for your eruv, how many apples do you need? Amar lei, to which Rava responded, V'chima avin betapuchim. Can you make an eruv out of apples? We'll say, Pashas, you can't use apples for an eruv. We'll see why. Simmer says, V'lo, why can't you use apples? V'hat tonight we learn, Kala ochim mitztarfin lifsalas hagavia b'chatzi pras. So we'll say, in general, this is by tumas ochlin. So remember again, a person cannot contract tumah from food. If you have food that is tameh, and I touch it, I can't contract tumah. What can happen is if a person ingests food that is tumah, depending on the type of tumah we are talking about, that can convey tumah to the individual. So therefore, so if you look at Rashi just a moment, lifsal sagavia, imachal ochlin tmein afagav shein ochel matame adam b'maga. If a person consumed tameh food, even though normally food can't convey tumah to a person through contact, if a person eats a half a pras of tameh food, which is the volume of 2 eggs, he is prohibited to go ahead and eat truma. So we'll say all foods, all tameh foods, combine together to form that shir of chatzi pras. Similarly, all foods combine together to go ahead and combine and create the amount of 2 meals for eruv purposes. So we'll say, this is actually, we're going to talk about this in a little bit. This is actually quite interesting. What this is telling me is, I need the amount of food for 2 meals. But you might have thought it's only one type of food. One type of food. Kamash, we're going to see different types of food could be mistariv for that shear. And I will say it is the size of a beitza that has the ability to allow food to contract tumas ochlin. So we'll say, so v'hai mighty yufta. So I don't understand. So we'll say, so the Gemara is basing this based on the idea that kala ochlin mitzdarfin la'eruv. All foods combine to form eruv. So therefore, all food should include what? Should include apples. So why did Rava seem to have a problem with apples for Erev purposes. Omaiti yufta ilema mishum diktani kala ochlin. Maybe so. Again, what's the question that they're asking on Rava? Rava, you said you can't use apples, but the Brisa says, or the Mishnah says, I should say, it says all foods, which would seem to include apples as well. V'hani b'nei achilin V'hamar Rabbi Yochanan ein l'meidim min haklalos afilu makom shnei bar b'chutz. Oh, Boss, so what does the Gemara do? The Gemara goes back to the original sugya in this parak. What did Rabbi Yochanan say? Whenever the Mishnah espouses a rule is never fully inclusive. There are always exceptions. Not only that, the Gemara says, and even when afilu makom shnei bar b'chutz, and even when it lists the exceptions, know that the full list of exceptions has not been mentioned. Ela mishum diktani ubimazon shtei seudos la'eruv ukebetz l'tamei tumas ochlin. V'hani nami b'nei tamuye tumas ochlin minhu. Suppose that the fact that we're connecting eruv together with tumas ochlin, just like apples are capable of contracting tumas ochlin, therefore b'pashtos they should be usable for the eruv as well. Okay, v'kama, and how many? Suppose that now we've established, in fact, you can use apples for an eruv. How many apples do you need for your eruv? Rav Nachman tapuchim bekav. It's a kav of apples. One kav of apples is the amount of apples you need for the eruv. Meisir b'Shimon Elazar Omer uchla tavlin v'litra yerek. So we'll say now in this particular brisa, Rav Shimon Elazar is going through and teaching us how much of each particular food item, what amount of each particular food item is necessary for eruv purposes. So if you're going to use spices, you need an uchla. Rashi says uchla is shminis sheba litra, v'litra ulog, 1/8 of a log. So 1/8 of a log of spices, right? V'litra yerek, and 1 litra of vegetables. V'asara egozin, 10 nuts. V'chamisha farsikin, 5 peaches. So we'll say this is all considered to be mazon shtei seudos. Shnei rimonim, 2 pomegranates. Esrog echad, and 1 esrog. V'amar gorsak bardari mishmeid Rab Menashe. Second wide line of Bosei Chavtes Amud Aleph. And Gorsa Bar Dar Sinin Rab Menashe Bar Shegavuli or Shiguvli Mishmei Derav V'chein le'eruv. These are the amounts for eruv as well. V'hani nami ki afarsikin. So both say, remember again. Actually, I'm sorry. These amounts that they were talking about over here was for tumas ochlin. Tumas ochlin. No, I'm sorry, that was incorrect. Look at Rashi, Reb Shimon Elazar, excuse me. B'maiser ani, excuse me. Reb Shimon is actually commenting over here on maiser ani, that when you go and you distribute food to the poor, how much do you have to give? Look at that Rashi, Reb Shimon ben Elazar. B'maiser ani shemechalko la'aniyim. This is about maiser ani, tithe to the poor, that you're giving it out to the poor. So la'aniyim harbe ala goren kai. V'kamar in pochsin la'ani begar mahayshir, d'chsivin asat levi la'ger la'asoma amana, u'b'tzor me'achilon l'havin esina. So we'll say the Torah says you have to give to the poor. So in order for it to be called a nesina, a giving, you have to give some significant amount. So therefore the Bryce over here goes through the various amounts of each item you have to give. Now when it comes to peaches, how many peaches do you have to give for Maiser Ani? 5. So we'll say the Gemara is going to assume the chen le'eruv, right? And then the Gemara says, "V'amar gorsak bardar mishmei derav Menashe bar shagvuli mishmei derav v'chein le'eruv." The same amounts that apply for Maiser Ani will apply for eruv. So we'll say, or to say a little bit differently, how much do you have to give an ani with Maiser Ani? Mazon shtei seudos. That's the halacha. You give him the amount of food for 2 meals. Okay. So now we'll say, so for example, what's the amount of peaches you would have to give for 2 meals? 5 peaches. The Gemara says, "V'hani nami the halu kafar second." We assume both say that apples are in the same category of peaches. So therefore, again, remember, what is the Gemara asking? We've established now that you could use apples for an eruv. Now we're trying to figure out how many apples do you need. So now the Brisa comes along by Maiser Ani and says, the amount you have to give to an ani is 5 peaches. And it says the same halachas by Maiser Ani, the same halachas by an eruv. So if you wanted to make an eruv out of peaches, you would use 5 peaches. The Gemara assumes peaches, apples, same thing. So if it's 5 peaches, it's 5 apples also. To which the Gemara says, no, hani chashivi v'hani lo chashivi. Ultimately, again, peaches are chashiv, apples are not chashiv. Now, both say, when you see this, what this obviously means is that the variety of apples that they had were not considered to be significant. In other words, this is nothing against apples over here, right? You could have apples that are just as chashiv as peaches, but apparently I don't know the apples indigenous to Bavel, but apparently the species of apples that are found in Bavel were not considered to be chashiv fruits. Amar Rav Yosef, Shari le Mari le Rav Menashe bar Shagvuli. So Rav Yosef said that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should forgive Rav Menashe bar Shagvuli. Why is this? So the Gemara says, Ana Amrisa nehili amas nisin. Because Rav Yosef said, I mentioned my statement, ultimately again in relationship to the Mishnah. To the Mishnah, V'hu amra abraisa, and he took my statement, or he took the statement and attributed to the Braisa. Disnan, here we go. Ein pochasin la'ani migorin mechatzi kavchitin. So we'll say, going back to my ani for just a moment. If you're going to, when you're dispensing food for an ani, you have to give him something significant. So how much do you have to give? Well, again, it depends on the item being given. Ultimately, in chatzi kavchitin, if you're giving wheat, you have to give a half a kav. Kav sa'orin, 1 kav of barley. Rabbi Meir Omer, chatzi kav sa'orin, the kav v'chetzi kosmin. Rabbi Meir says, no, it's a half a kav for wheat, a half a kav for barley, and 1.5 kabin of kusmin. Spelt, the kav grogeres. And ultimately, again, 1 kav of dried figs. So we'll say, you just begin to see, you have to give the ani what's called an asina, something significant. So obviously, the sheer of significance is going to vary one item to the next. Oh, mana devela. Or I will say 1 mana, ultimately, again, of a cake of pressed figs. Rabbi Akiva Omer, pras v'chatzi lug yain. Rabbi Akiva says, no, you don't, you only have to give a pras. Right? V'chatzi lug yain, half a lug of yain. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Rabbi Akiva Omer pras. So you don't have to give a mana of a devela. Rabbi Akiva says you have to give a pras. So they're arguing on the measurements. V'chatzi lug yain, you have to give a half a lug of wine. Rabbi Akiva Omer revius. Rabbi Akiva says a revius. Or revius shemen, you have to give a revius of oil. Rabbi Akiva Omer shminis, you only have to give 1/8 of a log. Ushar kol aperos, and when it comes to all other fruits, Amar abashol kedei sheyimkareim v'yikach bahem mazon shtei suda. So both say, when it comes to all other fruits, how much do you have to give to fulfill the mitzvah of Meiser Ani? We really frame it not in terms of a number of fruit, but rather what? A value. You have to give enough fruits that if you were to sell them off, you would have enough money to purchase 2 meals. V'amarav v'chein le'eruv. And Rav said the same applies ultimately again to Eruv. So I say, so again, how much fruit or how many apples would you have to give for Eruv purposes? Enough to go ahead and be able to sell it for enough money to purchase 2 meals. Umay umay dahai. Why is this interpretation any better than the one we had before? Maybe because here it mentions spices. And tavlin aren't normally considered to be a food item. Spices aren't generally considered to be food items, which makes a lot of sense, because at the end of the day, the role of tavlin is not to be consumed by itself, but rather again to enhance the flavor of something else. To which the Gemara says, Atu hacha milo katani, does not also mention over chitin usaorin, v'lav b'nei achilaninu. Both say, so again, even if you want to say it mentions tavlin, it also still mentions chitin and saorin, which are clearly food items. Elam mishum diktani chatzi lug yayin. Rather, ultimately, again, he liked this interpretation better because here it brings down the halachos by wine, a half a lug of wine. If you look at Rashi is supposed to say in the wide lines, third wide line in Rashi. Elam mishum diktani chatzi lug yayin. Dahainu shtei revi'os v'shamina le'lerav nami gabe eruv deka'amar hachi. So we'll say again, because since it mentions wine, and by wine it says chatzi lug, 1/2 a lug is 2 revesim, right? 2 revi'as shiurim. Again, that's the amount also that would be mazon shtei sudos. That's why I like that interpretation. Good. V'amarav ma'avim b'shtei revi'os. So again, Rav said you can go to make an eruv with 2 revi'os of wine. So we'll say, which is actually very interesting. So again, this is what we mentioned before. When we say mazon shtei seudos, so normally we would assume that mazon shtei seudos actually means enough food for 2 meals. So we'll say, what we're beginning to see is that's not the case. What we're beginning to see is actually the definition really is the amount of food that would have normally be consumed by 2 meals. So for example, if you want to make an eruv from wine, you can make an eruv from wine. How much wine do you have to use? 2 revesim, right? 2 revi'os. Because the assumption is, what would you drink at a meal? 1 revi'is per meal. 1 revi'is per meal. So the Gemara says, so I'll say, since we needed this whole interpretation, you could see that when Rav said that statement, so too by Eruv, was not going on the Braisa, but rather was going on the Mishnah, Shma Mina. Good. So I'll say, so what comes out over here is apples can be used. Apples can be used. It appears that the amount of apples that can be used, halacha lamaisa, is the amount which could be sold, and could be sold for the value of 2 meals. That's true by Meiser Ani. That's true ultimately again by Eruv. And now we're beginning to see by Eruv is pretty much like we saw in the Mishnah, any food item can be used. But halacha lamaisa, it has to be enough food. It has to be the amount of that food which would normally be consumed in a meal. So the Gemara says, Amar Mar, ubamazon shtei seudos le'eruv, Savar Rav Yosef Lameimar. And we'll say when it comes to the amount of food necessary for 2 meals for eruv purposes, Rav Yosef felt ad deika suuda mehai usuuda mehai. So we'll say now we're going to get into this a little bit. It appears that according to Rav Yosef holds that halacha lamaisa, there has to be enough food from each of these food items in order to create an entire meal. Amar li Rabba afilu lemechza lishlish urevia. Rabba said no, that's not the case. Rabba said halacha lamaisa, even if no one food has enough for mazon shtei seudos, so you have a little bit of everything, as long as all of those items can combine together for mazon shtei seudos, that is good enough for eruv. Gufa amarav ma'arvin b'shtei revios shal yayin. You can make an eruv out of 2 revios of wine. Omi ba'inan kol yahai. Rabba will say, now do we need that much wine for an eruv? After all, again, or the Gemara says, "V'hatanya, Rabbi Shimon Elazar Omer, yayin kedei le'echol bo." We'll say, how much wine do you need for an eruv? Enough wine to eat with. Now we'll say, if you look at Rashi says over here, lish yayin kedei le'echol bo, lishros bo pas mazon beisu. This was actually very interesting. So apparently, wine in the context of a meal was used in 2 different ways. Sometimes wine was used as a drink, but sometimes it was used ultimately as a dip. You would dip your bread into it. So we'll say, so this is fascinating. So now the Gemara is saying, when we say, now remember, when it comes to eruv is mazon shtei seudos, enough food for 2 meals. So the Gemara says, how much wine is that? 2 revi'os. Now the Gemara says, I don't think you need that much, because 2 revi'os sounds like that's enough wine to drink. But the truth is, wine was also used as a dip. And if we're using wine as a dip, you need much less than a revi'us per meal. So the Gemara says, here's the difference. I'm sorry, skipped. Vinegar, enough for what? To dip your bread into it. If you have olives and onions, that should need enough to eat 2 meals. So we'll say, so which one is it? So do I need 2 revi'os of wine? Because that's the amount I guess I would drink. I would drink at least a revi'os of wine per meal. Or can I use much less wine? But I'll look at wine not as a drink, but rather what? As a condiment to the bread. Well, if I'm using it as a condiment to the bread, then I need much less wine. To which the Gemara says, all depends on your wine. Hasa b'dechamra mevashla. But there is talking about yayin mevushal. Look at Rashi, cooked wine. B'chamra mevushal. Ka'amar dechashav lalafes bo. Avachamra ba'alma ba'inan lios bo shteos beisudos. Listen to this. Apparently, Bisman Gemara will say, no one would ever drink cooked wine. Cooked wine, yayin mevushal, was considered to be an inferior grade of wine. So therefore, again, everything depends on the type of wine you're using. What would you use cooked wine for? That you would use for the dip. Se'inachinami, if you're using cooked wine, you could use a lot less wine for your eruv because it's a dip. But if you're using uncooked wine, that's more chashiv. That would normally be drunk. And that halacha lamaisa, you would need 2 revios. We'll say, just as an aside, interestingly enough, the Rambam paskins that for Kiddush, you have to use yayin that's not mavushal. That's how the Rambam paskins. You have to use wine that's not mavushal. So again, Shulchan Aruch doesn't paskin that way, but that's how the Rambam paskins. Rabbi Soloveitchik, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, is makbid on this Rambam, and therefore only make Kiddush on non-mavushal wine. It's very, very interesting. So some have a hakpada that dafka by Dalit Kosos, even if you make Kiddush over mavushal wine the rest of the year, that by Dalit Kosos, by the 4 cups on Pesach, there is dafka an inyan to use non-mavushal wine, because again, that especially by Dalit Kosos, which has an element of chirus, of freedom associated with it, there's dafka an inyan to use non-mavushal wine. Okay, so the Gemara goes right there. So the Gemara says, it's very interesting. So far we're seeing you could use wine. How much wine? It depends. If it's mavushal, then it's dipping wine. If it's dipping wine, much less. The Gemara doesn't tell us how much, but less. If it's not mavushal wine, that's drinking wine, and that's the revius for each suda. To which the Gemara says, Amar chometz kedei l'tavabo. So it's assuming vinegar. If you have vinegar, how much vinegar do you need for your eruv? Enough for dipping purposes. In other words, we'll say the amount of vinegar you will use for dipping purposes in 2 meals. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Gidel, Amar Rav kedei l'tavabo mazon shtei sudos shal yarek. We'll say what it means is vinegar enough to go ahead and use as a dipping sauce for meals made of vegetables. So we'll say what this means is as follows. If you were to eat a full meal of vegetables, right? So you would need a dip, so you would use vinegar. So the amount of vinegar that you would use for 2 meals made up solely of vegetables. So we'll say, I'm saying to this chilik. You see, if it would have just said the amount of vinegar necessary for dipping for 2 meals, well, apparently, what would you normally dip into vinegar? Vegetables. Vegetables. So we'll say vegetables are a side dish. Right? It's not the primary, it's a side dish. So if you would tell me the amount of vinegar used for dipping, I would think you're talking about a regular meal where I only have a side course, a side dish of vegetables. So therefore the amount of vinegar necessary for dipping those vegetables. No, the Gemara says, imagine for a moment you are having a meal only of vegetables. It's the amount of vinegar you would need for 2 of those types of meals, which I will say, of course, is a much larger amount of vinegar, because if all I'm eating are vegetables, there's a lot more dipping going on. Suppose in a different version, no. It's not that you have 2 meals made up solely of vegetables, but rather the amount of vegetables consumed in a regular 2 meals. Okay, so we'll say machlokes about the amount of vinegar. So we'll say if you're using olives or onions, the amount consumed in 2 meals that would be good for Eruv. And we'll say, can you make an Eruv using onions? Vatanya, we learned, Amar Reb Shimon Elazar. Reb Shimon Elazar said as follows: Pam achas shavas Rabbi Meir be'ardiska. One time Rabbi Meir set up his place of dwelling in Ardiska. Rabbi Meir was in Ardiska for Shabbos. Uba echad lefanov. And there was a man who came before Rabbi Meir. Amar lo Rabbi, irafti be'betzalim letivin. Rabbi, I made an Eruv, this was not an Eruv Tchumen Rabosai, an Eruv Tchumen with onions, and as a result, I'm going to travel to the city of Tivin. So he was telling Rabbi Meir that he used onions for an Eruv Tchumen. Rabbi Meir said, you can't move any further than your Dalet Amas. Or in other words stated, Rabbi Meir was saying, you cannot make an Eruv out of onions. It does not work. So we'll say, which one is it? So Rabbi Meir is saying you can't use onions for an Eruv. The Brisa just said before, you can use onions as an Eruv. Lokashya, haba olim, haba imos. We'll say one is talking about the leaves, one is talking about the bulbs. Rashi says, olin, lo chashiv iraim lechol. So apparently olive leaves, right, the leafy part of the olive, that is not good, cannot be consumed, and therefore cannot be used for Eruv. But Lamais, again, the bulbs themselves ultimately could be used. This Sanya, the Gemara says, Achol batzal v'hishkim umeis. Listen to this. If a person ate an onion and then the next morning they died, ein omrim mima meis. We don't ask from what they died. I was supposed to say it's clear that he died as a result of the onion. So the Gemara says, Amar Shmuel lo shana ela ba'olim. That's only true with the leaves. Apparently, onion leaves apparently are very detrimental to one's health. Aval bi'imos less lanba. But I will say with the imos, which is the actual onion itself, the actual vegetable itself. I know bulb is the right word, but the onion itself is good. And furthermore, again, the leaves are only detrimental when on days delo iftzil zirsa. Aval iftzil zirsa less lanba. I will say look at Rashi. Delo iftzil zirsa shel gadlu zeres yeshlan aris babatzal. So we'll say. So ultimately, again, even that seems to be only when it's not fully mature. Zeres is an amount, is an amount. So I'll say, so apparently even the onion leaves are only detrimental when the onion is immature. But Lamaisa, if the onion is fully developed, the leaves are not problematic either. Furthermore, that's only when is the onion or when are the leaves detrimental? That's only when you didn't drink beer afterwards. Aval ishti shechra leslanba. But we'll say if you ate the onion leaves, as long as you followed that up with a beer, you are good to go. Tan Rabbanon lo yochal adam batzo neinacha shabo. Person shouldn't eat an onion literally because of the snake inside of it. I will say now, what does that mean? Right? Because apparently, again, onions. Rashi says aras saraf habatzal, the poison of the onion. So apparently, I will say this could also be generally related to the types of onions they had. So apparently there was felt to be something exceptionally detrimental. They call it poison. Poison doesn't really have to mean poison. The idea is there's something exceptionally detrimental in the leaves of the olives. Because of this, right? So we'll say one time, One time, Rabbi Hanina ate half an onion, and as a result of eating half of the onion, he ingested, quote unquote, half of the poison. He became very ill. V'natalamos, he was going to die. Ubikshu chaverav rachamim alav v'chaya b'pnei shasha tzrichalo. And his friends davened for him, and he was healed because he was necessary. Now, I will say that apparently, again, the other Rabbanim davened for Rabbi Hanina because Klal Yisrael, the community, needed Rabbi Hanina. Therefore, they davened for his refuah shlema. I will say, such an incredible story. The Maharsha comments on this. The Maharsha says on this Gemara, Maharsha says, Bikshu chaver b'nei hishashah, b'har b'makom Talmud Ashkechan, te bikshu achim acharein, v'lo k'amar kiachim b'nei hishashah. So let's listen to this. So the Maharsha is intrigued by the wording of this Gemara. They davened for him because he was needed for the community. But first of all, you could daven for anyone, right? I'm saying, what do we say? We only daven for people who are important and necessary, right? We daven for everyone for refuah shlema. Furthermore, many times in the Gemara, you have stories about great people who were ill, and the community davened for them. And it doesn't say mitnei shasha tzricha because Klal Yisrael needed them. So why is it stated here? So the Maharsha says something amazing. V'yoshlomar mishud Rabbi Hanina shehuz kahacha Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa shehu bal hamaisim b'kam makomos l'spal achaverav v'ka'amar hacha debikshu chaver rachim alav v'lo bikeshu rachim ishmael atzmo v'kar time they shasha tzricha lo sheisha b'meichal yo v'im bakashas al atzmo ma'ila k'bakash. Listen to this. Who's Rabbi Hanina over here? It's Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa. Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa was known for his legendary koach hatfila. Right? Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa was the one who said, I know, this is back in brachas, I know when my tefillas are going to be answered if they roll off my tongue easily. Right? If I don't stammer or I don't stutter, I know that my tefillas will be accepted. So we'll say, so apparently Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa himself was the individual in the generation with the greatest koach hatfila, the greatest power of prayer. Therefore, his rabbinic colleagues davened on his behalf that he should have a refuah shlema because the community ultimately needed him. Now, the Maharsha points out he didn't daven for himself. So we'll say, what's also interesting about this story is, how did he become ill? He ate the onion, which means he placed himself into makom sakana. Interestingly enough, he placed himself into sakana. Maybe he didn't know, whatever it is, but Lamaisa, they davened for him because he was a necessary part of the community. We'll say, first of all, what an incredible musar, right? So the shaila is, when a person looks at themselves, am I a pillar of the community that the community will be deficient without me? Right? Once you hear that, a person has to ask about the quality of the life that I'm leading. Am I someone who, if I'm not here, I would be missed? Or at the end of the day, life will go on in the greater Jewish community as normal without me? I will say it's an important shaila to ask ourselves: how much are we giving to Klal Yisrael? How much are we doing for Klal Yisrael? How much are we contributing? And I don't mean money. Money, of course, is important, tzedakah. But Lamaisa, myself, you see, Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, they daven for him because Klal Yisrael needs him. When Klal Yisrael needs you, Rabbosai, that's a schus that allows you to overcome many obstacles, including, again, apparently deathly circumstances. Incredible. Sheikhar, ma'arvin bo, you could go ahead and make an eruv with beer. Uposalas ha-mikvah b'shlosha zugin. I will say, if you have a mikvah that is less than 40 sa, right? That's the amount of a mikvah. So remember again. So if you have less than 40 sa of mikvah water, so halacha l'maisa, 3 lugin of what we call mayim she'uvin, of drawn water, can invalidate the mikvah. I will say, remember again, we've seen this before. Once a mikvah hits 40 sa, which is the amount for a mikvah, even if you introduce other items into it, it does not automatically render the mikvah unfit. But before the mikvah gets to 40 sa, introducing 3 lugin of alien liquids goes then and invalidates the mikvah. So therefore, if I have a mikvah less than 40 sa, and I have 3 lugin of beer that fall in, it invalidates the mikvah. Maskef Rav Kana Pshita, okay, that's obvious that beer goes ahead and invalidates the mikvah. We'll say, why would that be different than any other colored water? If you have a mikvah that's less than 40 sa and 3 lugin of drawn water fall into it, it invalidates the mikvah, right? So we have colored water that falls into it, invalidates. So why is beer any different? This is not Yosi Omer. We'll say if colored water falls into a mikvah that is less than 40 sa and 3 lugin of it fall in and invalidates the mikvah. Ha'amri hasamai detziva mikri. Because I might have thought that's called colored water. So because it's colored water, it has din of mayin shuvin. This is called beer. I would have thought that maybe beer doesn't have the status of drawn water, so to speak, and therefore shouldn't invalidate the mikvah. Kamash malan that it does. 3 lugin of beer that falls into a mikvah that is less than 40 sa'ah invalidates the mikvah. Become arvin. Both say, and again, how much beer do you need to go out and make an eruv? So the Gemara says, Savra v'achabred Rav Yosef kamid Rav Yosef the member tartin revi'i shichra. Rav Yosef, you need 2 1/4 of a kav, 2 1/4 measurements of a kav in order to go out and make an eruv. Kidisnan hamotz yain kedem mizigas hakos. Both say, now this is going back for just a moment, back to Shabbos. Hotzah. Both say, remember again, we spoke about this on Shabbos extensively. You're not allowed to carry an item from one domain to another. If you do, you're chayiv. But I will say, remember again, you're only chayiv if you carry a significant amount. What's the definition of significant? What's the definition? It changes item to item. That's a subjective share. Hamotzi yayin, for example, if you go out and you carry wine on Shabbos, you're chayiv if you carry enough for kedem zigas hakos, enough to go ahead and dilute 1 glass. Because remember again, I will say, how did they used to make wine in the times of the Gemara? They would make wine concentrate. So when you wanted a glass of wine, you would take some wine concentrate, mix it with water, and now you have a glass of wine. So halacha l'maaseh for Shabbos, if you carry enough wine concentrate to make 1 glass of wine, you will be chayiv. So the Gemara says, kos yafa, my kos yafa, kos shel bracha. Both say enough wine to make a good kos shel bracha, wine used for a mitzvah, benching, kiddush. Amar Rav Nachman bar Avua, kos shel bracha. We'll say, what's the ratio, dilution ratio of a kos shel bracha? Kedeshim zageno, v'yamod al revius. So we'll say kos shel bracha is enough ultimately again to make a revius of wine. So the Gemara says, Kidirava, Damarava kol chamer delodari al chad tlas maya lav chamru. Both say any glass of wine that is not 3 parts water to 1 part wine concentrate is not considered to be wine. V'katoni seifa ushar kalamashkin b'revius. All other liquids are both say measured with the revius. V'chalashovchin b'revius, and wastewater is also measured b'revius. Okay, midahasam al chad arba. So we'll say since wine is made up of 4 parts, 3 parts water to 1 part wine. Hachanami al chad arba. I would have thought that beer also, we'll say, is 1 part beer concentrate, 3 parts water. V'lohi hasam debetzirmi hachi lo chashiv. Aval hacha lo da'avidi inish deshasu kasa b'tzafra v'kasa b'panya v'samchalai. We'll say, let's look at Rashi for just a moment. Actually, not yet. So the Gemara says it's not necessarily so. Why is that? The Gemara says it could be over here. Even less than that shear will not be chashiv. But when it comes to wine, I will say a person does not normally go ahead and make a cup to drink in the morning or make a cup to drink in the afternoon in order for them to combine and to be somich on that. Look at Rashi. The shasi kasa sharavias log shecha b'tzafra the kasa b'panya v'samech alei. I will say a person won't normally make a beer of a revius of a lug in the morning and a revius of a lug in the evening and rely on that to combine. Fine. So bottom line, halacha l'maisa. When it comes to beer, so again, remember the amount of beer will ultimately be 2/4 of a kav. 2 1/4 of a kav is enough for beer for eruv purposes. Tamar and bekama. We'll say, what about dates? What about dates? So how many dates does one have to go ahead and use for an eruv? Rav Yosef tamar and bekav. 1 kav of dates. Okay, Rav Yosef minala. How do I know that? This sanya achol grogeres or shilim tamar. Both say it's an interesting case. What happens? Suppose say this is a case where I accidentally ate truma. Rashi says over here, achal grogeres shal truma b'shagi. Suppose say if I ate figs. Now remember, grogeres are dried figs. So I accidentally ate dried figs of truma. Suppose say what's talacha when you go out and you eat truma accidentally? You have to repay that which you ate. So achal grogeres is shilim tamarim. So if I ate figs and I repaid the coin in dates, tavo alav bracha. Suppose say you should be blessed. You should be blessed. So if you went ahead and you ate figs and you repaid with dates, yasher koyach. That's a great job. You should be blessed. So heichidami, we'll say, what's the case? So we'll say what that sounds like is figs are better than dates. What's the case? Heichidami. Bless you. So say if you're telling me that I ate a zuz worth of figs from the Kohen and now I'm repaying him with a fig's worth of dates, what's the mailer Rabbi say? At the end of the day, my tavala bracha. I consumed a zuz worth of produce, and what? I repaid a zuz worth of produce. So we'll say, so remember again, if we're talking about values, then it doesn't really matter what I repay with. What matters over here is the value. Elalav lefi mida. Rather, we'll say it must be that I'm repaying the measurement. The alchamine giruya digro geres, the shavya d'zuza, the kameshali le giruya de tmarim de shavi arba. But rather, what's the case? The case is where I ate a giruya of figs, which is worth 1 zuz, and I paid the coin back a giruya of dates, which is worth 4 zuzim. Vikatani tavala bracha. And the Mishnah says you should be blessed. What do you see from here? Alma tmarim adifi. I will say from here you see that what? That halacha lemaisa, tmarim figs are better, dates are better than figs. Look at Rashi. Alma tmarim adifi. Utnan le'el gabe ani begoren kav grogeres va'amarav v'chein le'er koshkein tmarim devadai sagilu bahachi. So we'll say, listen to this, and now going back. Remember, by meiser ani, what's the amount of figs you have to give for meiser ani? A kav of figs. So we'll say if a kav is enough for figs, then what? It goes without saying that is enough for dates as well. Why is that so? Because we just proven from this Mishnah by Truma that what? That dates are better than figs. So therefore, if a kav of figs is enough, certainly a kav of dates is enough for Eruv as well. So the Gemara says, only Abai li olam di ochel minei bezuzah, the kameshalim bezuzah. So Abai says, well, maybe not. Maybe the case of Truma, where the Yisrael accidentally ate Truma and is now paying the coin back. So we'll say, even though I went ahead and I ate a zuz worth of figs, and I pay the coin back with a zuz worth of dates, that's still tavo alav bracha. Why? The Gemara says, "My tavo alav bracha." Da'acha min second Y line chavtesim dalef. Da'acha mine midi de lo kafetz alei zevina the kameshalim le midi de kafetz alei zevina. Because it was at the end of the day, this is actually very interesting. It is better to have a zuz worth of dates than it is to have a zuz worth of figs. Why is that? Because more people want to buy dates than want to buy figs. That's what it means tavo alav bracha. Supposed to say, even if I'm giving him back the same exact value, so I consumed a zuz worth of figs, and I'm giving it back a zuz worth of dates, that's still tavo alav bracha. That individual is still blessed. That's still better. Why? Because it's easier to sell a zuz worth of dates than it is to sell a zuz worth of figs. And halacha l'maisa, that's beneficial to the Kohen. Good. Shesisa. We'll say, what about shesisa? So remember again, we had this in brachas. Right? The shesisa. Michael sha'osim mikemach kalish and yabish betanor. V'nosten dvash tel. So we'll say this is something. The shesisa is a dish. It's like a porridge. It's made from oven dried grain mixed together with honey. So it's like a porridge. So I want to use shesisa for my eruv. How much shesisa do I have to use? Amrav Acha bar Pinchas. Trei shargushi. 2 spoonfuls. 2 spoonfuls of shesisa is enough for the eruv. Kisi ani. What about kisi ani? Rashi says klayos. Klayos are roasted grain kernels. How much do you have to use? Amar Abaye trei buni de pumpadisa. But say ultimately again, this was a measurement. 2 pumpadisa in buni. Amar Abaye Amar the my mother said to me, Hai kisi ani mama ali liba. But say, so if you eat parched grain, that's kisi ani, is parched grain, right? If you go ahead and you eat parched grain, klayos, Rashi says, my mother told me it's good for the heart. Umevatli machshavta, and it goes ahead. Rashi says machshava daiga. This is very interesting. Apparently, eating parched grain sets your mind at. I'm sorry, skip. Yeah, it sets your mind at ease. So apparently, again, I guess parched grain has a soothing effect on the individual. Good to know. We'll say, what would you not give to have something that soothes the mind? I mean, I always thought it's just a good glass of wine, right? Or 3 that soothes the mind from all of its daiga. So apparently, again, there is a cheaper alternative as well. Probably parched grain does it as well. My mother said to me, if a person will say suffers from a weak heart, or right or some type of heart illness or ailment, this is very interesting. So take a piece of meat from the right leg of a ram, right, of a male goat, of a ram. And I will say, what should you do? So first step is take ram meat from the right leg. Rashi says, then what's next? And Rashi says, Sifi bakar. Take manure that came from a cow during the month of Nisan. If you can't find any of that, v'ileka kiburi derisa, laisi sugaini da'arafta. Go ahead and take, Rabbi say, sugaini da'arafta, kis mishal rava, take branches from a willow tree. V'nichbie, so Rabbi say, so remember again, what are you using the excrement? So remember, either take manure from a cow during Nisan, or branch the willow tree. Rabbi say, that's your heat source. That's here. So Rabbi say, so that's what you're going to cook the meat on. So you're going to take ram meat from the right leg of the ram. You're going to cook it over a fire. Fuel that fire, ideally, with manure that comes from cows during the month of Nisan or from willow branches. And then what? V'nechol, eat the meat. V'nishtei basra chama marka. Then afterwards, go ahead and drink diluted wine. And if you go ahead and you do this, Abaye says, my mother said to me that ultimately, again, this is a good remedy for heart illness. So apparently a person suffers from chol shel liba, ultimately use this remedy and a person will be healed. We'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up at the 2 dots tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll back in Mirat Hashem to a regular schedule. Shkoyach. We'll say on Zoom, Yashikach. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Shkoyach. I'm looking at all of you, but just my monitor is on the side. Yashikach to everyone on Zoom. Wonderful. It's to learn with all of you. Have a great day.